keep you all from asking too many questions. No, by all means, ask questions. All right. This is a part everybody always seems to like, or maybe not like, depending on what happened, but what the legislature did during this last year. And this year's session was, you all heard this, this is a quote from Baron Otto von Bismarck, which is, people, there are two things that people should not see, and that's sausage being made and laws being made. And this particular session at the legislature was really, there was a lot of sausage making going on. It seemed like on almost every bill of any significance or of any interest, always something going on. And a lot of deal making and a lot of discussion behind the scenes going on. So, probably a little more than what I remember generally or experienced in the legislature in the past. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in legislation. Let's start with maybe the biggest issue that was in the session up there, other than maybe the Health and Utah issue, and that was transportation. And kind of like, well, why should planners, planning commissioners care? Well, really, transportation, your road system, if you have transit, the transit system, otherwise, it's really it's the skeleton on which your community is built. And so, what kind of a system are we going to get? How's it going to be paid for? And how's it going to work? Is really an important part of our communities. And it's an element of our general plans. And so there's a lot of reason to have some good interest in what happened with transportation at the legislature. The effort was primarily to try and get increased funding for transportation from the state, because the gasoline tax, which is one of the biggest sources of funding specifically for transportation, both for the state and cities and counties, that gasoline tax hasn't gone up in something like 15 or 20 years. There have been other efforts in the past, and nobody ever wanted to do anything, and so there's been this effort ongoing for a couple of years at least, to really hit this and solidly show and demonstrate the need for increased funding for transportation, and also to broaden maybe the kinds of things that could be funded with transportation. On the gasoline tax, for instance, there's a constitutional restriction that allows gasoline tax only to be used for roads. But as we know, we have a lot of different ways that people travel now, including transit, bicycles, trails, walking, all of that, and that can't be funded with the gasoline tax. And so there have been a lot of interest in trying to do something a little bit different, and that actually happened this year. So such a big issue, and was going around and around. There were several bills that were introduced during the session that dealt with transportation, but it ultimately boiled down to two main bills. One that would have just been a flat raise of the gas tax, and then the other one, which was this House Bill 362, which dealt with the gasoline tax, primarily a fuel tax, I should say, because it's on not just gasoline, but fuel tax that also gets expressed as like a percentage tax rather than just a flat cents per gallon, with the idea that as time goes on and as inflation or cost increases, and as various things change in our society, it isn't just about the number of gallons used, but it's actually about the value of the fuel that's being used and trying to maintain a base of funding. So that was a big part of it. And then also to allow some more options for cities and counties to, first of all, have some increased funding and then how to use that funding. Specifically, some of those laws that were changed, well, we'll get there. We'll talk about this next. So, here's the detail. Ultimately, in the end, what it came down to was House Bill 362. It became the end game for the whole transportation funding, and it didn't get decided. The deals didn't get cut. Everything was finally settled upon, and it didn't happen until 11:45 that night, and the legislature adjourned 15 minutes later. That's how long this whole debate went on, and it actually started long before that, so it was quite a deal. The basics of it are this. The fuel tax is increased immediately by 5 cents a gallon. And then there is also a sales tax that is put onto the sale of fuel in the future. There's a ceiling and a floor level to that fuel tax, and the fuel tax doesn't actually kick in until the wholesale price of gasoline reaches $2.45 a gallon. We're a ways away from $2.45. being the wholesale price of fuel, so the sales tax won't kick in for a while. But the money generated from all of those fuel taxes will be distributed around the state on the B&C Road Formula Fund, which is, I think it's like 60 or 70% goes to the state, and 30, 40%, whatever that is, goes to the cities and counties. So there will be an increase that will go to both from the fuel sales tax increase. And that's a positive. The other part, big part of that bill was authorizing local governments to impose a quarter-cent sales tax for transportation. And that quarter-cent sales tax would be allowable to be used for not just roads, but also for transit and for what's called active transportation, bicycles, trails, for those kinds of facilities. The distribution of that quarter-cent sales tax will be 1/10 cent to cities, 1/10 cent to transit districts, if there's a transit district in that county, and a 0.05 cent that would go to counties for regional projects. So the 1/10 cent that goes to cities also goes to counties for the unincorporated areas. They're treated just like cities are in the case of where they build and maintain local roads. That 0.05 is intended to go to counties for bigger facilities. You know, the important, the bigger highway, the bigger roadway that goes through a community, the bigger other kinds of facilities. Question in the back.
What's the trigger on that? Is that just automatically sent to the
No. So the process is this. In order to have that quarter-cent imposed, the county governing body has to vote to put it on the ballot. And then it has to go to a ballot, to a vote, and be voted upon and pass by the electorate in an election. Now, it can be done in any election, any November election. So it can be done this November, the following November, which is a general election. The one coming up this November will be a local election, but it can be done on either one of those. It's up to the county governing body when they want to put that on the ballot. And it's only the county governing body that gets to decide that. The distribution of that will be, as I said, to the cities, the transit district, and to the counties. In counties where there is not a transit district, the county will get the 0.15. They'll get the share that usually would go to transit otherwise, as well as the 0.05. And again, that's intended to be for regionally significant projects. And most counties, obviously, the discussion that I have heard during the legislative session is that most counties probably will not look at putting this on the ballot until 2016, which then it would go to a vote in November of 2016, and then would, if it passes, would be imposed in the early part of 2017. So it's a ways away before that money might begin coming. That's not to say that jurisdictions couldn't put it on the ballot this November. And there are a few places, a few counties that are talking about doing it this November. Salt Lake County is actually beginning to talk about that. In fact, I have to bug out here a little bit early to get to a conference of mayors meeting where this is probably going to be one of the items of discussion as to whether Salt Lake County tries to get that on the ballot for this November, because otherwise you're talking about a 1.5 year wait, or almost a 2-year wait before you get any kind of revenue from that particular source of funding. So that was, like I say, along with the Healthy Utah issue that was in the legislature, this was probably the other big issue that the legislature dealt with and took up a lot of the oxygen in the room with discussions in the legislature. Any questions on that? 362, House Bill 362. One of the other big issues was prison relocation. And it wound up not affecting a lot of communities because you had a prison relocation commission that met the year prior, and they actually developed a list of preferred sites, or sites that they were restricting themselves to looking at. The list, I think, was 5 or 6 sites long, and boy, did it cause issues. Every community ultimately came out and opposed, and strongly opposed, the potential relocation of the prison to their community, and so this became a real hot potato. And then you also had a group that started to get active and say, we ought to just keep the prison where it is. And that was part of the discussion. There were a couple of different bills that were introduced in the session. So one that would have introduced as keeping the Draper site on the list, another bill that would have said that the legislature has to decide, and there was a lot of back and forth about that one. But in the end, things got worked out to the point where the Prison Relocation Commission, which is made up primarily of legislators, a few legislators, they will do the review of the project. Oh, and they added a couple of more sites to the list. They took a couple of sites off, and then they added a couple more to the list during the time the legislature was in session. So this commission will make the determination of the preferred site, and then the legislature has to affirm that. So it is going to take legislative action to do it. There was something added to the bill in the last days of the session that became really controversial, particularly for a particular mayor in a particular big city. And that is that the legislature added into the bill that the city or the community that winds up receiving the state prison can impose an additional half-cent sales tax. And the idea there, I guess, is sort of to be an incentive, sort of to allow for some increased revenue. In most of the communities that are being considered, that probably really doesn't mean a lot because they don't generate a lot of sales tax. The communities are like Grantsville, Eagle Mountain, a couple of other communities like that. They really don't generate a lot in the way of sales tax. But one community that is being considered generates a hell of a lot in sales tax. And a half cent would mean a lot of money, and that's Salt Lake City. And Salt Lake City has advocated for some time now, saying, their population nearly doubles every day. All of the commuters that come into the community, they need some additional revenue source to be able to deal with that, perhaps some kind of a commuter tax. Well, this might be that source of revenue. The mayor says he had nothing to do with that, and having worked at Salt Lake City and knowing Mayor Becker, I believe that he didn't have anything to do with it. This is something that the legislature decided to do on their own. But in a way, you can almost say, wow, it almost kind of seems like it's predestined now going to Salt Lake City because they've put this incentive on there. But what it's done is it's kind of, the mayor's running for re-election this year, and candidates have come out and said the mayor was in a backroom deal and they're going to increase the taxes on the local residents and we're going to get the prison. And so it's been an interesting kind of a show to watch. If you're not one of the communities directly involved, it's been great to sit on the sideline with popcorn and go, wow, this is really fun. But the communities that are involved, it's become really a big deal.
Yeah, where's the possible site in Salt Lake City?
The possible site in Salt Lake is west of the airport, west of the International Airport and north of I-80. Out around the 7200 West, there's an interchange out there that's nothing around it, but 7200 West on I-80, and it's out in that area. Another bill that came up that kind of became a big deal was a bill with regard to townships. This primarily affects Salt Lake County, but it does affect other counties as well. Townships was something that actually appeared and became an issue, oh my word, 20 years ago. It's been a long time. The big issue was primarily for Salt Lake County, but some other counties as well, where you had a lot of development that had occurred over the years, not inside of a city or a town, out in the unincorporated area of the county. And pretty soon those areas were very much like cities or towns, but they weren't in a city or town, and counties don't have the same kinds of tools to deal with that kind of population base and urban development that cities have. And so there was a lot of, and then counties have a county-wide function. Well, where does the tax revenue from the counties go? Is it fair to have money that comes from county-wide taxpayers all over to help fund the services that go into those unincorporated areas? Because other places that are in cities, they have to raise their own taxes and revenue to do that. Big issue, big controversy that's been going on for a long time. And there was, 20 years ago in the legislative session, there was a debate about how to deal with this again. There was a deal kind of struck, the deal went away. All of a sudden, in like the last 2 days of the session, the Speaker of the House at the time came out with this concept called townships. And nobody had seen it, nobody knew anything about it. He was a very powerful speaker. Many of you may know him, Mel Brown. He said this is going to happen. Bingo, it happened, and all of a sudden we had townships, and once we had them, it was nearly impossible to get rid of them or to do anything with them. I personally didn't think it was very well thought out. I think that was kind of borne out about how the history of that. They've been repealed, they've been reinstated, they've had all kinds of provisions added to them. They're a really odd beast, and they haven't worked very well in terms of dealing with urban growth and urban development the same way that cities traditionally can. So this has been an issue that's been ongoing, and there's been, particularly in Salt Lake County, where you have 6 very urban, very big townships, and trying to figure out what to do with them. And finally, this session, Mayor Ben McAdams and people in the various townships finally worked out a proposed solution. That's what happened with this bill. This bill will actually now require the 6 big townships in Salt Lake County to have an election this November. They decide one of 2 things. They're either going to decide to incorporate into a city, or they're going to decide to become a new entity that's called a Metro Township. A Metro Township, there's a whole bunch of provisions in there that basically make it almost like a city, but not quite. And it restricts on, they go get their own services, but it restricts on where they go get them and how they do that. And there's a lot of provisions in there. It's you know, nobody really liked the solution, but it was better than what existed. And so it's kind of a step in the right direction, everybody's hoping, and so that's what's going to happen in Salt Lake County. What it did for the other counties that have townships, how many of your counties have townships? A couple, a few of you do, that were created in. Outside of Salt Lake County, well actually everywhere, townships now go away. There will no longer be such a thing as just townships. In Salt Lake County, they will vote to become what's called a Metro Township, which I just explained. In the other counties, they go away, they become what's called a planning advisory area. And their planning commissions will know, and most of those planning commissions were structured so that at least some of their members were elected. That whole election provision goes away. Their planning commissions will now simply be appointed just like any other planning commission is normally appointed by the governing body. And so, and then there is the possibility to create new planning advisory areas, but the process by which you have to go through to do that is pretty onerous. So I don't think it's very likely that you're going to see any new or very many new planning advisory areas established under this law. So that's primarily what this particular bill does. Charlie?
Does it require counties that have townships to adopt into the rule to make that change?
No, state code just does it. State code just does it.
Change the
Yep. As soon as this goes into effect, the law goes into effect May 12th, I believe, is the effective date. So as of that date, there will no longer be townships. There'll now be a planning advisory area. Those that are on the planning commission will continue to serve out their term, and then any new members will go through an appointment process rather than an election process if they were elected before. John?
I guess this is just for Salt Lake County, but what's the effect on annexations of the metro?
Yeah, the metro townships, the annexations are not allowed.
Okay, so it freezes all those unincorporated towns.
Yep. Yep, it does. They could eventually in the future perhaps choose to incorporate, and you know, who knows, there may be some legislative fixes that will come in the future again with regard to that, but that's where it freezes them now. Okay, one other bill that kind of follows on to this, and again, it applies primarily, pretty much only in Salt Lake County, because the bill is, the language is structured so that it says counties of the first class, but allows for the creation of what's called a mountain planning district. Actually, the bill says mountainous planning district. But this has everything to do with the ongoing, many of you heard of the Mountain Accord that's been going on, this effort to look at the central Wasatch, basically the area from Party's Canyon to Little Cottonwood Canyon, and what to do with it. Because you have so many varied interests in there, and there's a lot of pressure to do various things with that. That central Wasatch area receives over 7 million visitors a year. You know, between the ski resorts and people that have a hike and the picnic and the camp and to do everything, 7 million visitors, that is more than most national parks. And yet this area is smaller than most national parks, by far. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure that's on that area. There are some private properties in there. You've got some areas where you have homes and cabins. You have the ski resorts. You have the federal lands. I mean, there's all kinds of issues in this area. And so this is another step to try and kind of address that. It allows for the creation of a mountainous planning district in Salt Lake County, which will probably be that central Wasatch area, and get a more representative planning commission, in essence, that will then be made up of some of those interests for that area. And then ultimately, there'll probably have to be some kind of thing to go on to make what's happening with Mountain Accord come about in that area. So kind of an interesting little beast. We'll see what happens.
So that's specific to Salt Lake County?
Yes, right now, the language of the bill says that it's in counties of the first class. So that would only be Salt Lake County. You know, if other counties are interested in doing something like that, I think in a future legislative session it may be possible to look at expanding the ability to do that. It has some interesting powers. In the middle of that area, you have the town of Alta. This particular bill says that that particular mountain planning district planning commission and then the county council will have land use authority even in areas that may be in an incorporated community, other than Alta. And Alta got carved out because it's been in existence for a number of years and has some of their own standards and regulations in effect there. So it's an interesting little beast. There was a lot of unease about this, particularly from like the ski resorts and from some of the private property owners. So this bill has a sunset date. It goes away on June 1st of 2016, unless it gets extended, and that kind of puts the onus on Salt Lake County to try and perform and show that this may accomplish and do what it's intended to do, so that at the next legislative session, that sunset can be lifted. Okay, let's talk about annexations. Over the years, as communities and cities in many locations have annexed, as they did so, annexations were primarily driven by property owners asking to be annexed into a community, and not all property owners wanted to be. And in the early days of annexation, that kind of happened on a random pattern or a checkerboard pattern. And so, as this map of Sandy City shows, in a lot of places you wind up with islands or peninsulas. That's really hard for counties to service those islands and peninsulas in an effective manner. And to deal with the issues that come up in there, and then with the adjacent cities nearby. So several years ago, in the state code, the provision was put in that said any annexation cannot create a new island or peninsula. And that's been in the code now for several years, as I say, and it's been a good provision. Everybody thinks it's been very positive. Well, this bill came up in the legislative session that now would have kind of changed that and allowed for annexations to create an island or a peninsula. The way the language of the bill is written, it says if the county and the municipality agree. So both have to agree to that particular annexation if it creates an island and peninsula, and then it can be done. My understanding is that this issue came about because of something going on in Iron County. Somebody from Iron County? Do you know anything about the particulars of this? I mean, I've heard a little bit, but I don't know how accurate it is.
I don't.
I saw you slump down.
Anybody? I see somebody smiling, big smile back there, yeah.
I grew up with a representative that sponsored this bill, and our city, this Cedar City attorney worked real close with him, and they started to try to get my support, and I fought them so hard on it that they just included me in it. It is a bad bill. I fought them on it.
I think that's the general feeling
It is.
of most people. They really don't like this. This bill actually got through the House, and then when it got to the Senate, it just sat there. I mean, it got through early in the session, the House, but for a long time, nothing happened in the Senate. And I think that's because the general opinion of most local officials was it's not a good idea. But my understanding is that there was a situation in Iron County where you had a property owner that wanted to develop, and in order to develop, they needed to annex into a nearby community, but there was an intervening property owner who didn't want to annex, and it was kind of viewed as being obstructionist, and so there was a lot of back and forth on this. Has been going on for a while, and so this bill was proposed, and people weren't thrilled about it. I think most local officials still don't like it, but it went, right?
What the bottom line is really is that the cities won't take the initiative to exercise the option on the old bill that if you have that either the area or the valuation,
Right.
that you can force them in. They want to be reelected, so that's the problem. You know, it's
Yeah.
politics always enter into it, and that was the issue.
My guess is we'll see this come up again, because there'll be issues that'll happen because of this, but we'll see what happens and how that goes. This House Bill 53, local government residential reimbursement, and Charlie, you may know a little bit more about this. I think Ogden was a big pusher of this, and I don't know how much Weaver County was involved, but this was an odd bill. It first came up last year in the legislative session, and none of us really knew what it was all about. And we thought it was kind of weird because what it allowed, or what it required in last year's bill, was that a local government, city and county, had to set up a fund to help reimburse people for the costs of resurveying, retitling, and redoing properties that were in essentially like a little condo association. And we were all going like, what in the world? And it required that you did that. And it was kind of like, what is going on? So last year the bill didn't succeed. Well, we found out more about it this year. It seems that a number of years ago, particularly when this whole concept of having twin homes and condos and PUDs and so on, you had a number of developments that occurred. And because you had common areas, the walls, the roof, the other structures right between them themselves, and land area around them, they were created with like a homeowners association and a joint ownership of that facility, of those particular facilities. And we all know homeowners associations work just great, right? Really well. Now imagine a homeowners association that's only 2 owners, or maybe 3 owners, or a handful. And if one doesn't like what the other one's doing, forget it. And as these developments began to age, and in particular in some communities there was this need or this effort to do some redevelopment, but they were stymied by this whole arrangement of these homeowners associations and joint ownership and tenancy, and to go through the process to have the properties resurveyed and a new plat developed and all of that work to be done actually was starting to get kind of expensive. And in those cases where cities like Ogden City, I understand, was a big proponent of this because they wanted to see redevelopment, and I think they were willing to assist the property owners in helping to get this done, but legally they couldn't do it. And so this particular bill now allows for a mechanism to be set up whereby a local government can set up a fund and help assist property owners in doing all of this legal work to get rid of those homeowners associations and get the property resurveyed and replatted and all of that work to be done so that then the development, the redevelopment of those properties can occur. So it was kind of an odd deal, but I think once everybody finally figured out what was going on or understood what was happening, there wasn't a big objection to it, so that particular bill went through this year. This particular bill, House Bill 70, the posting of political signs, deals with communities that allow political signs on public property. Not all do. In fact, I'd almost say most don't. But some communities do allow political signs on public property. Apparently that was raising some issues where maybe not everyone was getting fair or equal treatment. And so what this particular bill says that if the local government, or any government, even the state, any government allows political signs to go on public property, you have to allow all political signs. And any regulation of that has to be content neutral. So, I mean, it's not, it's a fairness bill, a fairness issue, so it makes sense. Some people were thinking when this bill first came up, it says, oh my gosh, it's going to allow now everywhere on public property. That's not what the bill says. What the bill says, if you, as a city or a county or a state or a government entity, allow political signs on your public property, you have to allow all political signs. And your regulation of those has to be content neutral. You can't say what kinds of signs can go up and what can't. It has to be content neutral. Okay? Just to kind of clarify that. All right. This particular bill, again, this is just kind of a procedural issue. So many of you are probably very familiar with this. Whenever you post your public notices for meetings and your agendas for what's going to happen in those meetings, you also have, not only do you have to do it in a public place and location and all of that, and oftentimes on your own website, but you also have to ship a copy over to the state public notice website, where there's a comprehensive list of all the public notices throughout the entire state of all entities. There was an exemption in the law that was put in when this was originally required, that for any entity that has a budget of less than $1 million, they don't have to do this. I guess with the idea that, this costs you something in order to do this, and those smaller entities, it was kind of a burden on them. Well, everybody, I think, has figured out we live in the internet age and the electronic world, and everybody can do this now relatively easy. So that restriction was lifted. So now every public entity in the state, regardless of size, when they do public notices, they have to post it also on the state's public notice website. Very straightforward, very easy. All right, this particular bill, rental modifications, this had to do, this is all kind of being driven by when you have particularly older homes or older structures that have been, say, converted into apartments. And a lot of times those older structures, because they are so old, they don't meet current safety codes and regulations. And so there was it's been a push by some local governments that if you're going to have apartments in those kinds of structures, you need to bring them up to code. Well, some of those structures, it's pretty hard to do, if not downright impossible in some. And so the property owners and the owners of those units were looking at that as particularly burdensome. And it has been the subject of quite a bit of wrangling, both in the local governments and with the state legislature, because of course this makes its way up to the state legislative level. So there have been bills passed in the last couple of years that put some restrictions on what kind of requirements you can put on those kinds of entities. Again, as I say, with older homes, a lot of times, those homes are what you call non-conforming. And so this particular bill, there were actually like 2 or 3 different bills that dealt with this issue in this year's session. This is the only one that passed. And this particular one was trying to deal with non-conforming homes and what requirements could be placed upon them, because a lot of times what the local entity would also say is if you're going to have an apartment, you got to bring it up to code and you got to make it conforming. And again, that was viewed as by many of those owners as pretty burdensome. And so this bill was drafted that basically said you don't have to meet those requirements if you're a non-conforming use. Well, the way the bill was drafted, it didn't apply just to rental apartments. It applied to almost all kinds of non-conforming uses. And we all know we all have a lot of different kinds of non-conforming uses out there. And so that was causing a lot of consternation on the part of the local officials. So the bill was redrafted and now applies only to non-conforming residential units. And there are some restrictions on there as to what you can require with regards to the egress requirements, to the electrical and the plumbing codes, and other safety and access changes that can be required. John?
Was there a distinction made between non-conforming use and non-conforming structures? Meaning,
yeah, there probably was, but I have to go back and look at the bill.
Some of these are probably conforming in a residential area,
But the structure's not. Yeah, and I think that's what it was primarily dealing with, is non-conforming structure. But the way it was originally written, it just was non-conforming uses in general, which was really an issue, a problem. Question?
Does this apply only when there's a change, or is it you got to do it?
So what happens is, in some cases, some communities are requiring business licenses for rental units. And before they can get a business license, they're sometimes requiring that these changes have to be made. Which means that houses that may have been, basement apartments and things that were being rented out for a long time, now the community requires a business license and they can't get the business license. And so that was part of the issue too, is that they've had this non-conforming right going for some period of time, and now all of a sudden they won't be able to because they can't get the business license, because they can't qualify to make by having to make all these changes. So this puts restrictions on some of that. It still requires or allows the community to require some things, just not all the things I think that were maybe sometimes being asked. This is a fun one. You may have heard about this. This actually made it into the national news. This is with regard to a bill. Well, let me tell you the story. And I was in Salt Lake City at the time that this went through. So Salt Lake City, in its effort to be more of a bike-friendly and a pedestrian-friendly, a more walkable community, was looking to change a number of provisions in its ordinances with regard to walkability, bike accessibility, and so on. And they made some changes to the requirements for drive-up windows in commercial zones. And one of the requirements, and actually, this is an instance, Brent, where I just mentioned to you, where we just talked about in the previous session, where the Planning Commission recommended one thing, and the City Council took it even further than what the Planning Commission recommended. But what the ultimate code changed, ordinance change that passed by the City Council was that a business that has a drive-through window when it's open for business at the drive-through window, they either have to allow bicycles to come to the drive-through window, or they have to have their lobby open so that bicyclists can pull up, park their bike, and come inside and be serviced. Well, a lot of the drive-up, primarily the fast food restaurants that had drive-through windows, did not like that provision. But it was passed by the city council, in place. They went to the legislature debated this, and ultimately passed a bill that prohibits local governments from requiring such a provision, that you have to allow for bicycles and pedestrians or pedestrians to be served in drive-through windows, or to have to keep your lobby open if you are, have your drive-through window open and somebody comes up and they're not in a car. And as I say, this was a deal that made it on the national news as something, one of those interesting, funny little deals that happens. But it was an interesting debate in the legislature, because you had some of the legislators that were, I think rightly so, saying, look, is this really something that the legislature needs to weigh in on? Isn't this something we should just leave to the local communities? They should be able to decide whether they want to require something like this or not. But what often happens in these provisions is when property owners or affected owners, something goes against them, and we'll see another bill in a little bit, and they don't get their way at the local government level, then they go to the legislature. It's almost kind of like, running from mama to dad. Okay, if mom will take care of it, I'll go get dad to take care of it. And that's kind of what happened. And it was interesting that issue got debated in the legislature this time on this. And there were a number of legislators who said, we really ought to not be sticking our nose into the local government's business. But it wasn't enough, and the bill ultimately passed. So, kind of an interesting deal. This is an interesting bill, too. This was a bill that showed up that basically, in its first draft, would have prohibited municipalities, and that was interesting to me, because this has to do with agricultural structures called high tunnels. But it only restricted cities from putting any kind of regulation on high tunnels. Now I thought, well, that's interesting. If I can see maybe why cities, but wouldn't the same thing apply in counties? But the bill wasn't drafted to apply to counties. It was drafted only to apply to cities, and nobody ever brought up that issue during the discussion on this. The problem was that as you began to look at the bill was pretty uniformly, pretty blandly drafted, and just called these structures called high tunnels. Well, you got different kinds of high tunnels. And so you got like the one up on top, which is, just a framework and some fabric or plastic or something draped over it. You've got the ones that are a little bit more like on the bottom, and they have foundation, they have or a concrete pad of some kind, and a permanent kind of a roof made out of corrugated metal or something more permanent. And so the issue for many became, well, look, we can see maybe those kinds of high tunnels, but really you want to do that with all high tunnels? And so the bill was amended to apply only to these, what they call more the temporary kinds of high tunnels. It doesn't apply to the more permanent kind of structure of high tunnels. But they are to be allowed, they cannot be regulated, in other words. And they also, for taxation purposes, they're to be taxed, not to be taxed as structures. I don't remember exactly what the bill said, but there was some provision in there about that as well. So, yeah.
Not be regulated for good setbacks.
Yeah, not be regulated at all.
Right.
Yeah. Kind of an interesting. As you may well know, there's been a lot of issues in this state with regard to who should manage the federal lands. Should it be the feds or should it be the state? And a lot of tension that exists there in that regard. This particular bill would require that if a government entity in the state of Utah, and that means cities, counties, water districts, whoever, if anybody enters into discussions with the federal government about selling or transferring property to the federal government, they have to notify the legislature that they're doing those discussions. And then if they decide to either transfer or sell property to the federal government, if it's less than 500 acres, they have to notify the legislative management committee. If it's more than 500 acres, they have to get the approval of the legislature in order to be able to do that. Bill went through without a lot of debate. It went through pretty easily.
Hey, Will,
Yeah.
is that just sell or is that trades too? Because we had a lot of private landowners trade.
No, this is only for public land, sorry.
Oh, okay.
This only applies to public land. So a
Okay.
city or a county that has some land and they're talking about, selling it to the federal government or whatever. Regardless of the amount, you have to notify the legislature that you're talking to the federal government about doing that. And if it's less than 500 acres, you have to notify the management committee. If it's more than 500, you have to actually get legislative approval. in order to be able to do that. Kind of related to that, but a little bit different. And this is a bill that's going to affect, you guys are counties, this is going to affect all of you, okay? This bill requires that every county has to have in its general plan what's called a resource management element. State code right now requires that you have to have 3 required elements in your general plan. That's a land use element, a transportation element, and a moderate a housing element. This bill now puts in for counties a 4th element. You have to have a management, resource management element in your general plan. And the bill says it has to be done by July 1st, 2016. The bill is very specific about the kinds of issues that have to be looked at. Has a whole long list of them.
By July 2016?
2016, right, a year from this July. It has a whole long list of issues that need to be addressed, and you have to make certain kinds of statements about that. There has to be coordination between counties about these kinds of resource issues. It's a pretty detailed list of how to do planning and what to plan for. This is all prompted, folks, frankly, by, again, this effort and the desire to have some say or at least some ability to manage and control federal lands. And so from that standpoint, this is looked at to be something that's put out there that the federal government has to take into account and coordinate with local governments in as they do that. Question?
Any provision for funding for this kind of thing?
Yes, and I'll talk about that shortly.
It should also be noted, so federal law requires certain governmental agencies to coordinate for consistency with local plans.
Right.
The problem is, most counties we haven't had local plans we can coordinate with, so federal law provides for some direction to be given
Right.
to those agencies, we just haven't given them that direction.
Yep. So as I say, this bill now requires it, and it requires every county to do that, which is an interesting issue for like Salt Lake County and Davis County and probably Weber County, because like in our case, the only real federal land that we've got is in the mountains, and that's a whole nother kettle of fish about what's going on up there. Certainly different issues than what's taking place, say, in southern Utah. But yeah, we are required to do this as well. And so it's going to be an interesting deal. Now, funding. There was an associated appropriation that went with this that I think it was $1.5 million that's appropriated. It will allow for each individual county to apply for and receive up to $50,000 in order to do this. But there's restrictions on how you use that $50,000. There has to be coordination with a state committee that's called the Committee on Stewardship of Commission on the Stewardship of Public Lands, and that commission is supposed to engage a private consultant, and that private consultant is supposed to create the framework and then assist these counties. And your $50,000 is supposed to go to that. So you have to kind of deposit money with this commission, and then this private consultant is supposed to help you. And so there's all kinds of weird restrictions on how this money can be used. No, it doesn't. Not in the bill, it doesn't. But I'm guessing there's probably somebody out there that they had in mind that that knows how to do this or so on. So this is kind of a big deal and kind of a big provision for all of the counties to be aware of. If you don't have this adopted by July of 2016, there is no penalty. So, it requires it, but there's no penalty. But still, I mean, it's one of those issues. So we'll see where that all is. This particular bill, again, this is a part of the ongoing saga of the wars between local governments and schools, school districts in the location, siting and servicing of new schools, and particularly charter schools as well, because as you know, several years ago there were